In order to plan and scaffold a lesson properly, it is important to first take a look at how people learn a new item of language, such as a new grammar point. The learner first starts with ignorance or of a level of incomprehension. Then the learner progresses to exposure, where the learner encounters the item through conversation or reading. Next, the learner starts to take notice of that item. Once the learner starts noticing that there is an item that he or she has been encountering but doesn't fully understand, is where understanding begins to develop. At the stage of understanding, the student is actively engaged with the item and working out rules and meaning. Once the learner understands the item, they are able to move on to practicing. This is the stage where the learner finally takes the item out for a test drive. Lastly, the learner is able to incorporate the item into their language use, perhaps with minor errors or perhaps not, but doing so relatively easily. This diagram shows the same process, though is slightly more complex. It separates exposure into restricted and authentic. These two types of exposure are important to think about when planning lessons. Authentic exposure refers to what is considered to be reasonably normal, natural text or speech. Examples of authentic exposure could be reading magazines, books, articles, or product labels. It could be listening to small talk or the radio. It could be watching English TV or movies. It could be as simple as living in a place where the language is used. Restricted exposure, on the other hand, is specifically designed to be accessible to learners, such as textbooks and textbook recordings. This type of material tends to draw focus to target language points and often have graded text and audio. This diagram also makes a distinction between types of output, authentic and restricted. As you may already have guessed, authentic output is natural speech or text that is produced by learners with the language that they have at their disposal, such as open discussions, meetings, writing a postcard, negotiations, or chatting in class. Restricted output is controlled and deliberate, and mainly focuses on practicing specific language points through drills, grammar practice activities, simple games, or written gap-fill activities. It is important to keep in mind that not all of these ideas and definitions are clear-cut, and represent points on a continuum rather than completely separate categories. It is important to remember that this is just one representation of how people learn language. Therefore, make sure to examine this theory and others and how they connect with how you believe that people learn language. It is your own personal belief and subsequent theories that you need to incorporate into your lesson planning. One way to think about lesson planning depends on what you will be teaching. If you happen to be teaching a specific language item, such as a specific grammar point, lexis, or a function, a good way to think about planning is to break it down into bricks. These bricks can be put together in various sequences to create different lessons. Here is one example, which is often referred to as present practice. These bricks can also be broken down. Much of what happens during a lesson overlaps, as is represented by the brick configuration. Clarification can happen during exposure and also during output. These tend to operate on a continuum that is constantly in flux during a lesson. Next, we will take a look at the diagram that we saw from earlier. However, this time it has been integrated with the bricks. Take a moment to study this diagram and notice how clarification overlaps with exposure. The bricks shown here can be used to help us plan lessons. These bricks allow us to scaffold different types of lessons that use specific types of activities. Brainstorm for a moment what types of activities each of these bricks might include. Lastly, here are some alternative brick configurations to the present practice configuration that we saw earlier. All of the diagrams that we have seen are just a fraction of the ways to think about planning and scaffolding lessons. Be sure to continue to explore different scaffolding and lesson planning techniques to develop a personal teaching style that works for you and for your students.
To me, scaffolding is step by step of understanding. So you don't want to lay out too much and expect students to be able to do it.
For me, scaffolding, when I think about it, I think it's like giving the students the tools necessary to go on to the next level. So what do they need to know? And this will go into objectives, I guess. Sorry. Like, what do you want them to know by the end of this? What do you want them to learn? What do you want to teach? How do they need to, what do they need to know beforehand to get there, basically? So if I want them to be able to read a whole passage, I'm not going to just give them the passage first, right? We're going to work our way up there. So I guess that's the way I think of it. It's like thinking of beginning to high levels for each thing that you're doing, each activity, each grammar point.
Building off of what you've done before,
Yeah.
and then it's also planning for the future, so it's kind of like slotting in, so it's past, present, future, all built into one off of the scaffolding.
And so you set a strong base of something that you think the students understand so that you can build up on top of it, and then once that is stable enough and the students can use it, you build up on that and on top of that. And so for me, scaffolding is just kind of building up as you go from the bottom.
Giving good, clear, and concise instructions can be difficult. However, good instructions can make all the difference in the world to students and the success of an activity. First, make sure to get everyone's attention. Be sure to give instructions using simple language and use gestures when appropriate. A lot can be communicated without words. It can also be helpful to do a demonstration. You could do this with one or more students or with the whole class. Always be sure to check with students to make sure that they know what to do. These checks are often referred to as comprehension check questions, or CCQs. CCQs are often considered to be more useful than asking students if they understood what was said. How much time do you have for this activity? What information are you listening for? Can you work with a partner? These are all examples of CCQs. It is at this point, after having given instructions, that you can pass out materials or handouts that will be used. If you hand them out before giving the instructions, the students tend to be more focused on what you handed them rather than what you are saying. Make sure that they know what their time limits are, and it is important to monitor the students, but do your best not to interfere. Lastly, give them a time warning when they are running out of time and get feedback from them about how the activity went or what they learned. Here again, you can use CCQs. Using the white or chalkboard in your classroom can be an incredibly effective tool for scaffolding. However, it is important to plan out how you are going to use the board. Planning board use out on a piece of paper beforehand can be very helpful. If you are teaching a vocabulary lesson, it is useful to divide up the board where you will keep track of new vocabulary, pronunciation, IPA, etc., keeping these items separate from other topics you're using on the board. When using the board, make sure to write clearly in print letters and not too big or too small. Using different colors for highlighting purposes can be very effective in helping students move through what you have written on the board. Make sure to give students enough time to copy things down. Also, incorporate activities where students come up to the board and write things. It is important to include your students as you write on the board by asking them to spell words or indicate where word stresses are. Do not overload the board with too much writing so as not to overwhelm the students. Write only when is needed and use handouts on the projector to supplement.
It's my experience of, doing it one way without, leaving a lot of middle steps out. Didn't work. When I did it more step by step, and I like your way of describing it, of what do they need to know to be able to do the next step.
Yeah.
It works out much better. And sometimes you may see, even during the process, you may see, whoops, they don't know this other step, so time out.
Yeah.
Let's add another scaffolding step in there. So you still have to be flexible. Again, what you were talking about. Oh yeah, right. Yeah. Present.
Practice and produce.
Yes.
Yep.
That's it.
Got those people? Do you know it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's basically scaffolding, right? You want to present the students what they are going to be doing, so they have that background knowledge. You want them to practice it themselves, but in a very guided way, so they're not just left off to their own devices, and then eventually you want them to be able to produce it on their own. So, I mean, that's...
Present, practice, and produce.
I don't know, for some reason, some of my lesson plans that I've done, I realized that I didn't scaffold it well enough. And I don't know, it's really hard, especially when you're in a mixed levels class, to scaffold. That's where I struggled the most.
You're planning it to help scaffolding.
I always start with some sort of like introduction, like really basic, usually fun introduction that leads into like the directions and then the rest of the class.
Yeah, I usually introduce something either explicitly or implicitly, and then it becomes explicit.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have like an easier activity, and then you give like a more in-depth activity. I just remember the thing that I think Kim told us, the content easy, process hard, process easy, content hard.
So the first time they're learning expectations and what you want them to do and how they're going to do it. And then, so the next time you do it, they don't have to deal with that. It's just dealing with the content itself.
Just within one lesson, but scaffold across a curriculum, build towards things from one week to the next. And also I think this is where like assessments, even if informal, come in really well, because you won't know if you can move on to that next step with the stair steps. You won't know if they are ready to come up that step until you kind of test them in some way, and not like formally, but just even just asking them, or designing an activity to elicit what you're working on, then you can move on and do the more building off of. So there's some assessment involved in scaffolding, I think. If you don't scaffold, you're like really at risk of losing your students. Not just like the fact that they're not coming to class. I mean, they could get to that point if it's like a community ESOL kind of thing. They might just not show up if they think it's too hard, or just mentally they're just lost. And there's like really no worse feeling than like having like a lesson that was just like way too hard for your students, that you didn't like scaffold enough for them. And so it's just really important for like their own affect, I think, so that they can feel like they're succeeding too, and they feel like they're making progress. I think that scaffolding might be like my favorite thing about teaching ever, so it's just really important.
So in a sort of more of a micro sense, sort of like stairs.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm kind of viewing it as, I mean, the stairs is certainly true, but I kind of see it as like stairs of a building. So it's not just the stairs that you've been on right now for this to get to this particular floor. It can be five floors back as well.
Yeah.
And so the 5 floors back, I view it as keeping that topic alive